Hello again. In the last video I introduced the idea of memes, and I also argued that if memes are going to be a useful way of looking at how ideas develop and evolve, then we would expect memetic evolution to follow the same kind of process as genetic evolution. In this video I want to have a look at some of the objections to the idea of memes, and then in subsequent videos to see if we can begin to solve them. Right. The first objection to memes is that they're Lamarckism. It's Lamarckian. The second one is that the fidelity of copying in memes is simply not good enough. Right. Let's have a look at Lamarckism, or to start off with. Okay, in the meme machine, Susan Blackmore argues that the replicating mechanism of the meme is simply copying. In the selfish gene, Richard Dawkins basically does the same. In the meme machine, Blackmore uses the idea of how urban myths spread, and that basically argues that they're just copied from one individual to another. And I think in the selfish gene, Dawkins uses how idiosyncratic behaviours are copied. Now I think the problem here is obvious. The problem is that it is the phenotype that is being copied. It is the behaviour that's being copied. It doesn't appear that there is any separation of inert code and phenotype. They're both arguing that basically what's being copied is the phenotype. Now I find this slightly strange. If we look at particularly coming from Richard Dawkins, if we look at the extended phenotype, he explicitly says how important he thinks Lamarckism, how important he thinks that Weissmanism is, the separation of inert code, genotype and phenotype. He describes the book as an extreme neo-Weissmanism, and I'm absolutely certain that he is right, that we need the separation of code and phenotype. If we look at genetic evolution, this is exactly what we get. We get inert code in the DNA. This is then transcribed into proteins. The proteins then are transcribed into RNA. The RNA is then translated into protein, and it is the effects that that protein exerts by changing the nature of the cell, the nature of the body, etc., the natural selection acts on. Natural selection is not acting directly on the DNA. So we have this obvious separation between code and phenotypic effect, and I think we're going to have to do the same thing for memes if they're going to be successful. Right, the next objection is the fidelity of copying not being sufficiently good, and again I think that there's a kind of real problem here. If the mechanism of replication is simply copying, then instead of a digital system, the copying of DNA is a digital system, we basically have an analog system. And the problem with analog systems is that they tend to degrade rapidly when they're copied. If you want an example, consider a music CD. if you have a music CD, you can copy it onto another CD, you can copy it onto another CD, and 20 or 30 CDs later you would still have basically the same as you started off with. If you did the same thing with an analog system, let's say a tape, by the time you got to the 30th tape, you would end up with nothing. You would end up with a hiss. The information would have been degraded to the point where it was useless. And I think this is a real problem for memes. If memes are simply copied, one copied by another, then we're basically going to expect them to degrade, and degrade so rapidly that evolution cannot act on them. I also would argue that in an analog system it's very difficult to add information. In a digital system, if you change let's say a letter in the DNA, basically you have added information. You've changed the information. By changing it, you have added it, or added some new information that can be that natural selection can act on. In an analog system, if you kind of blur it, all you're actually tending to do is move towards noise, and it's very hard to see how natural selection could actually act on that. Anyway, I think that sums up the two main problems with memes. In the next few videos, I'd like to have a look at ways of overcoming these problems. Okay, thank you.